Hello everybody, so I'm at the workbench today and that's because I'm doing an updated version of the twin coil chiller that I made in the previous video. This one, the Mk2, is going to be known as the TWINCHILLA. So let's get on with the build and I'll show you what's going on. Okay, so the new version, Mk2, the TWINCHILLA, is basically going to be same as this in terms of the concept, but there's a few changes to the design that I'm going to make that I'll explain before I actually get on with the kind of build process itself. I'm making this one for my friend Chris, aka Alchemist, so he was suitably impressed by the design and how this one worked in the previous video that he actually asked me to build one for him. So hopefully it goes well, because he's already sent me some money for it, which I've spent on all the parts. I guess if it is a total disaster, then I'll be sending him a refund, but fingers crossed it'll be all right. So yeah, cheers for that, Chris, and hopefully I will be able to make the new version even better than this one. So yeah, first of all, this actually just worked brilliantly. I've not got any major complaints about it at all. Really chuffed with the performance of it. It chills down in about 10 minutes on a full-size batch. By full size I mean about 23 litres. I have had it chill down even faster than that, so over the winter with the water being cooler and everything, sub 10 minutes a few times. Probably the quickest it's done that sort of size batch would be about 7 or 8 minutes, I think. So it just works really well. I'm really pleased with it as it was designed initially, but I'm a bit of a tweaker when it comes to stuff like this, so there were a few things that I mentioned in the previous video in terms of stuff that I thought might make it a bit better, and there's a couple of other ideas that I've thought up in the meantime that I'm going to look to change. So let's just go through the changes that I'm going to make to version 2 first of all before I actually start building it, and I'll explain a little bit about what I'm hoping they will achieve. So the first thing, which I mentioned in the previous video, is actually changing the outlet and inlet pipes to 15mm rather than 8mm. So on this one I was using the compression tees here and I couldn't get one that basically went from 15 to 2 8mm. Apparently there are adapter olives that I could have used to kind of cobble together something like that, but I didn't get them in the end, so it was all 8mm pipe. Now my theory obviously is basically if I have 15mm going in and then splitting into 2 8mm pipes, I potentially will get a better flow rate. As to whether it will make a huge amount of difference, I don't know, because you are limited a bit by the diameter of some of the fittings, like the hose fittings here on the end. But in theory it should give me greater flow rate of the coolant and therefore faster cooling, hopefully. I will also be using soldered joints this time, so partly so I can actually use the 15mm pipe going in, and also just to make it a bit sort of neater. This hasn't had any major leaks, but these joints can ease over time with the heating up and down, so they do occasionally get a little bit drippy, but if you tighten them up then they work fine again, so they seal back up. Obviously if I solder the joints that shouldn't be a problem at all, and we should have a totally sealed unit which will work better. Also it just means there's less in the way of kind of little nooks and crannies here for dirt and sticky stuff to build up in and potentially provide a route for germs and nasties to get in. The other reason for putting 15mm on the inlet and outlet is just basically to make it a little bit more rigid. So the 8mm pipe, it doesn't take a huge amount of pressure to bend this stuff, and if you're picking this up by the inlet and outlet pipe, or it was to fall over, it would be quite easy to buckle that quite badly. So hopefully with 15mm in and outs it will be a little bit more rigid and sturdy. What were the other changes that I want to make? The feet that I kind of put on this one, I'm going to move in a few coils just so that they are more stable. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference, but basically when you're bending the final rings into the coil, if you're also having the feet there, it makes it quite hard to keep the position of the feet in the same place. And the last thing that I was thinking of changing is basically putting a little bit of space in between the inner and the outer coils. So you can see, and if you watch the previous video, you know that I basically wrapped it straight around the outside of the inner coil, and that means they're very close together. There's not a huge amount of space. If there is a gap between there, it should allow flow of the wort through that gap and increase the kind of useful contact area of the copper to the hot liquid, basically. So again, that should increase efficiency. I don't know if it's going to make a huge amount of difference, because you know the hot stuff does get in between the coils. It's not a totally closed gap, but if it's allowed to flow over them easier, it should help a bit. So I'll put a spacer in between the coils when I'm wrapping them around and hopefully get a little bit of a gap there. The other bonus with that is it's going to make it a bit easier to clean. Now, as long as you kind of hose this off right at the end before it kind of dries off, it's not much of a problem, but there's obviously a lot of kind of hard to get to bits in between the coils where, again, it's going to be quite easy for kind of muck to build up, and you have to sort of get your hose pipe right in there and spray it with high pressure to make sure that it cleans everything out. It's not a major issue when it goes into the boiling wort to be sterilised at the end anyway, but for peace of mind it will just mean that I can actually kind of see in between the coils, or Chris will be able to see in between the coils, and clean it out a bit easier. So yeah, that's pretty much it, I think, in terms of the changes. If I've forgotten anything else that I'm going to do differently, I will go through that as we get on. So let's start building this motherfucker. Okay, so let's look at the parts first of all that are different. Essentially the parts list is the same as before, apart from the fittings are slightly different that I'm using. So I'll put the list of parts up on the screen. We have still got 2 rolls of the 8mm copper, but we do need some 15mm as well. So I've got some 15mm straight copper pipe for the inlet and outlets, and then I'm using for the T-pieces end feed copper T-pieces, and I've got a pair of 15 to 8mm end feed adapters for each one as well. So basically, rather than using that compression T, I can slot those together and solder that, and then I have my 15 to 8mm T. Nice and easy. The fittings on the end of the inlet and outlet will now be 15 to 15 couplers. So the reason we've got those on the end is so that we can fit the hose or lock style hose fittings, the quick release things, onto there. So you basically use the nut and olive as per usual on one end, and the other end fits the 15mm thread on your, or sorry, half inch BSP I think, thread on the hose pipe fittings. So those are the different parts we've got. I had to buy some solder and some flux, but I figure if I'm gonna do this again I'm gonna need that anyway, so I'm not kind of counting that in the budget for this one. And yeah, that's basically it. So let's get on with soldering some of these bits together. Right, so soldering. I hadn't ever done this until I had a little practice the other day with this little bit of scrap pipe and an old T-piece that I had, but it seemed to go quite well, and I got a reasonably neat joint on there for my first effort, I thought. So if I'm doing this horrendously wrong, and there's any plumbers out there watching in horror, then please feel free to tell me how to do it properly in the comments. But based on the instructions that I read, get some steel wool, tidy up the ends. These parts are all pretty clean anyway, but I'll just give them a scrub just to make sure. So it should be nice and shiny and clean, removing any kind of oxidized metal or stains on there. Give it a little wipe off each time. Do that with both ends that are going into this T-piece, and also just give it a little scrub on the inside of where the joint will be as well. So in this case, the inside of the T-piece on either side. Okay, we then need to get some flux on those. So this is your flux paste. pretty messy stuff. I'll just start with one end. So get a good covering of that. Smear a bit on the inside of the joint as well, and then slot them together. You're going to get a bit of excess there. I'll probably put more than you need, but like I said, I'm a bit of an amateur at this. But just wipe off the excess so you've got a nice bit of flux in the joint there, but it's not kind of smeared all over the place. And now that's basically ready to solder, so let's get all the flammable shit out of the way and move this stuff. Now, the one thing that I didn't need to read instructions on was don't hold on to copper pipes while you're trying to solder them. It's going to get pretty hot, yeah, so you're going to want something suitable to hold it in or brace it with. I've got one of these little drill vices here which seems to work pretty well. Obviously it's also metal, so that's not going to kind of catch fire. I'm using a really cheap blowtorch thing that you can use camping gas cylinders with. I didn't have a proper blowtorch, but this works reasonably well. So make some fire. These are great for lighting barbecues, by the way, and general pyromania. This thing never lights first time. There we go. Right, so we've got some heat, get a nice hot blue flame going on there, and then we basically want to get that flame onto the sides, one side of the joint that you're going to solder. And let's let that heat up for a little bit. You should see the flux starting to melt, and I'm going to hold the solder coil just against the other side of the pipe, as close to the joint as I can get it. And once it gets hot enough, you should see your solder begin to melt. There we go, that's just going now, and it should flood the joint. So make sure you get enough on there just to go all the way around the joint. That looks alright to me. And again, don't pick it up with your hands, this is going to be fucking hot, yeah? But it's probably difficult to see on the camera, but you can see a nice silver line of solder all the way around that join there. It's going to discolour a bit from the heat, but you can scrub it again with the steel wool just to shine it up afterwards, and that's basically a copper joint soldered. So I'm going to do the rest of those joins and then show you the finished bits at the end, so you don't have to watch me soldering all these separate parts. Okay, so I've finished off the T-pieces. There's one of them there, so they're looking alright, and two of them I've also wrapped the first coil around the same cylinder thing that I used before as my mould. Left quite a bit of extra on each end because I'm going to wrap the pipes around slightly differently to how I did before to the T-pieces, and I've taped a bit of cardboard around the outside to act as a spacer for the next coil that's going to go over the top of that. It's probably going to be a total bitch trying to get the cardboard out afterwards, but I couldn't really think of any other way to do that would work, so I was thinking of trying to put some sticks down the side or something, but it was just a faff trying to get them to stay in place. So cardboard it is. I might have to sort of hack that out afterwards to get it back, but let's see how it goes. Right, so I'm about 3 turns into this second coil. It seems to be working all right with the cardboard there as a spacer. I've had to feed on the spring pipe bender all the way around from the other end, so I didn't really think about that at first. It would have been easier if I'd fed it on before I started from the other end. A pipe bending tool would probably make this a lot easier and quicker at this point, but this is all I've got. So that's on there because I'm going to bend in the first kind of foot on the bottom of it, so bending in the feet about 3 turns in from either end, as I talked about at the beginning, just to make it a bit further in so it should stay a bit more rigid as part of the coil. Okay, so that's the second coil now wrapped around the outside. It was a bit more tricky to get them nice and tight around it with the cardboard spacer there, but I managed to get the feet in there quite nicely. There's a little bit more clearance on this one because Chris has asked for 50mm underneath. I think I've just about got 50mm, or it's pretty close to that, I think, when I measured it. Yeah, it looks pretty good to me. So I just need to get the spacer out now. That's going to be difficult, I could tell, because it's quite firmly wedged in there, and then I can start bending these pipes over the top to the inlet tees. Okay, so I've managed to get the cardboard out relatively easily. I just had to kind of rip it up a bit as I went along. It's worked quite well. There's a nice bit of clearance in between the 2 coils this time, so you can see there's a clear gap there in between the 2. It's sitting quite nicely on the feet, so that should work quite well. Maybe my only slight concern is it's sitting a little bit taller than the first version of this because of the extra clearance underneath, and also the diameter of the second coil is now a bit bigger, probably an extra centimetre or 2 of diameter on that, so that's added to the height as well. So hopefully it will still be fully submerged when it's in the pot that Chris is using. I've done a rough calculation on cylinder volume and it should still be submerged up to about 21 litres, which hopefully you'll still be happy with, Chris. But yeah, even if it's not, it would still just be barely popping out at the top, I think, if it was the case. So let's now bend over these inlet pipes and we'll fix the tees on, and then we're pretty much done, apart from getting the 15mm pipe on there and yeah, bending that into shape and adding the hose fittings. So nearly finished. Right, so there we have it. Got the T-pieces soldered into place. Got a little bit trigger happy with the solder on a couple of those joints, so there's a little bit of excess on there, but it's not anything major, and as long as the joints are solid, it's fine. You can see there's definitely still that nice bit of clearance between the 2 coils, so hopefully we'll get that improved exposure of the hot work to the copper coils. It's a little bit more compact than the other unit that I did, so slightly smaller footprint. As I said, it does stand a little bit taller, but that's looking pretty good to me. So just got to put those inlet pipes on. Right, so that's the inlet and outlet pipes on there. I've bent those twice so that they will go over the lip of the pot, hopefully, and give it a good bit of clearance in case there's any drips off of the hose adapters. One thing I realised pretty quickly was that if you're using one of these spring bending tools, don't cut the pipe too short first. You need a decent length of pipe to get the leverage on it, otherwise you have to put too much force on it or put it against an edge and it ends up kinking like that, or you get frustrated and take the pipe out, the spring out even, and just ended up with a completely fucked bit of pipe like that one. So once I'd worked out how to use it properly, the spring bender was okay. You just need quite a bit of a pipe to use as leverage, as I said. So you'll end up with a few offcuts, but otherwise it's okay. That's looking pretty cool. Kind of looks like some sort of crazy steampunk engine or something on the screen there, doesn't it? But yeah, so just need to solder these in and then we're good to go. Right, so soldered on inlet and outlet pipes, and we've got our 15mm straight couplings on the end of both of those so that we can then attach the hose or lock type fittings, which is the last thing to do, and then that is ready to send off to Chris. Right, so we've got the hose or lock fittings on the end there. I've wired it up to the hose supply, and we'll give it a quick leak test and check everything is ship shape. Okay, so you can see there's a bit of leakage there off of the actual hose or lock fitting, but that should be easily fixable with some a bit of PTFE tape. But the important parts, which are these solder joints around here, are looking totally dry. So there we have it, the finished article. Pretty pleased with how that's come out. All the things that I was sort of intending for this second version seem to have worked okay. Some of the soldering there was a little bit sloppy, but it's my first time soldering copper pipe, so not too fussed. As long as it's watertight, we're happy. That was lead-free solder, by the way, before anyone chips in and tells me that I'm going to poison Chris. So yeah, hopefully no potential for leaks and drips occurring with those. We've got a little bit of spacing between our coils on there, slightly higher feet on the bottom. It's a bit top heavy at the moment, so the spanner's just there to stop it from toppling over, but once it's in the pot it doesn't matter, because obviously the pipes will be hooked over the side. Not much else to say about it really. So yeah, 15mm pipe on the inlet and outlet should allow you to crank the tap up pretty high and get a good flow of water into it. So looking forward to getting this off to Chris now so that he can test it out and see how well it works for him. So I hope this version works as well for you as my one did for me, Chris. Okay, cheers guys.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness, or duder, or you know, El Duderino.